My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm 32 years old, and I'm a freelance graphic designer. It was just past 2 a.m. when the sound ripped through the quiet house. It wasn't a shout of anger or a frustrated cry, it was a choked, guttural sound, quickly stifled, but unmistakable. A scream. My sister, Maya, and it was coming from Mark's room, my stepdad's room. My blood ran cold, and for a split second, I was paralyzed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then, adrenaline surged. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed 911, my breath catching in my throat. My sister, I whispered into the receiver, my voice trembling, I think she's in danger. She's screaming from my stepdad's room. The dispatcher's calm voice was a lifeline, but my eyes were fixed on the closed door across the hall, the one that had always been a fortress of secrets. What I found that night didn't just expose Mark, it shattered the carefully constructed facade of our family, revealing a darkness I never truly believed could exist within our walls. To understand the immediate, desperate certainty that propelled me to dial those 3 numbers, you need to know the history of how Mark entered our lives and slowly, meticulously, began to unravel us. Our biological father left when I was 8 and Maya was 4. He wasn't a bad man, just a lost one, and his departure left a gaping wound in my mother, Eleanor. For years, it was just the 3 of us, navigating life in our small suburban house in Cedar Creek, Ohio. Then, when I was 15, Mark entered the picture. He was everything our dad wasn't, steady, attentive, seemingly devoted to Mom. He had a kind smile and a knack for making Mom laugh, a sound I hadn't heard much since Dad left. Maya, especially, latched onto him. She was still young enough to crave a father figure, and Mark filled that void with practiced ease, buying her little gifts, helping her with homework, and cheering her on at school plays. I was always a bit more cautious, a little more observant. My graphic design eye, even then, was trained to spot inconsistencies, to notice the subtle lines that didn't quite match. Mark was almost too perfect, his charm a little too polished. He moved in a year later, and they married when I was 17. Our house, which had always felt like a safe haven, slowly began to shift. Mark had a study, a spare bedroom he converted into his office. It was always locked, a private sanctuary where he conducted his important business. He worked in finance, he said, but his hours were erratic, and he rarely talked specifics. At first, it seemed harmless, a man needing his space. But then, little things started. Mark would make jokes about Maya's boyfriends, playful at first, then increasingly pointed, subtly undermining her confidence. He'd help Mom manage her finances, taking over the bills, gently suggesting she didn't need to worry her pretty head about such things. My alarm bells were faint at first, easily dismissed by Mom's newfound happiness and Maya's adoration. Maya started college 3 years ago, a few towns over, but she struggled with the transition. Mark, ever the supportive stepdad, suggested she commute from home to save money. He offered to pay for her tuition, a gesture that seemed incredibly generous at the time. That way, he'd said, his arm around her, you can focus on your studies without the burden of loans, and we get to keep our girl close. Mom beamed. Maya, eternally grateful, agreed. What I didn't understand yet was that this wasn't generosity, it was the first step in a calculated isolation. Maya's friends from high school slowly drifted away, replaced by a new, more solitary routine. She spent more time at home, less time out. When I suggested she look for an apartment with some classmates, Mark would interject, why pay rent when you have a perfectly good home here? Focus on your degree, sweetie. His words were always sugar-coated, always delivered with that same kind smile, but they carried an undeniable weight. The locked study became more than just a private space, it felt like the nerve center of Mark's control. He'd often retreat into it for hours, sometimes late into the night. If Mom or I accidentally left the door ajar, he'd emerge, his smile tight, and gently but firmly close it, murmuring about sensitive documents. I once saw him snap at Mom when she tried to bring him a cup of coffee, startling her with his sudden sharpness. He immediately apologized, blaming stress, but the incident stuck with me. Maya, bless her trusting heart, would sometimes knock, asking if he needed anything, always met with a cheerful but firm "I'm fine, sweetie, just concentrating." She never questioned it, never saw the subtle shift in his demeanor when someone approached that door. She just saw the man who was helping her get through college. But Maya herself was changing. The vibrant, outgoing girl I remembered was slowly fading. She became quieter, more withdrawn. Her bright eyes often seemed shadowed, and she started avoiding eye contact, especially with Mark. When I'd ask her if everything was okay, she'd give a strained smile and say, "Just stressed with classes, you know?" She started spending more time in her room, her phone often nowhere to be found, or she'd be hesitant to use it if Mark was in the vicinity. I noticed her flinching a few times when Mark would unexpectedly touch her shoulder, a reaction too subtle for Mom to register, but starkly clear to me. Once, I caught a glimpse of her screen when Mark called her, and her face went pale. She quickly dismissed the call, explaining it was just a friend, but the tremor in her hands told a different story. Mark's control continued to tighten. He started commenting on Maya's clothes, suggesting they were too revealing or not appropriate for a serious student. He'd check her social media, ostensibly for her safety, and make pointed remarks about her friends, subtly planting seeds of doubt about their intentions. He even helped her apply for part-time jobs, but every application seemed to fall through, or he'd find a reason why the job wasn't right for her. "You need to focus on your studies, Maya," he'd say, "and I'm here to provide for you. Let me take care of everything." He was systematically dismantling her independence, isolating her, making her utterly reliant on him. I saw it, but I couldn't prove it. Every attempt to talk to Maya was met with a wall of denial, a forced cheerfulness that felt more like fear. The night before the scream, I'd stayed up late working on a rush project for a client. The house was quiet, save for the hum of my laptop. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, light and hesitant, pass my door and head towards Mark's study. I assumed it was Mom, maybe bringing him a snack. But then I heard a hushed murmur, too low to distinguish words, and it wasn't Mom's voice. It was Maya's. A wave of unease washed over me. Why would Maya be in Mark's study, late at night? And why was she whispering? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was helping her with a difficult assignment, or she had a question about her tuition. But the image of her flinching, her pale face on the phone, the way she avoided my gaze, all coalesced into a chilling recognition. This wasn't just a controlling stepdad. This was something far more sinister, and Maya was trapped. I was still working when the scream came, a sound that sliced through the pre-dawn silence like a knife. It was muffled, as if someone was trying to suppress it, but the terror was raw and undeniable. It ended abruptly, followed by a heavy thud. My blood ran cold, but this time, I didn't freeze. The dispatcher on the phone was asking questions, her voice calm and professional. "My sister, Maya," I stammered, "she's 28. My stepdad, Mark Peterson. His room is at the end of the hall." I heard her scream, then a thud. "I think he's hurting her." I gave her our address, the layout of the house, every detail I could think of. My mind, usually focused on color palettes and typography, was now processing information with a terrifying clarity. I heard the distant wail of sirens, growing closer. I crept out of my room, phone still clutched in my hand, the dispatcher's voice a low murmur in my ear. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. Mark's study door was still closed. I could hear hushed voices inside, then a sudden, sharp command that sounded like Mark, followed by a whimper. My stomach lurched. The sirens were right outside now, piercing the night. I heard car doors slam, then heavy footsteps on our porch. I raced to the front door, unlocking it just as the first officer, a tall woman with a stern but reassuring face, knocked. "Police. Is everyone okay?" she called out. "No." I gasped, "It's my sister. In there." I pointed frantically towards Mark's room. Two officers moved quickly down the hall, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They pounded on Mark's door. "Police. Open up." A moment of silence, then Mark's voice, surprisingly calm. What's going on? Everything's fine. We have a report of an emergency, the officer stated, her voice firm. Open the door now, sir, or we'll force entry. There was a pause, a tense, agonizing silence. Then, the click of a lock, and the door opened a crack. Mark stood there, disheveled, his hair mussed, a forced smile on his face. Just a misunderstanding, officers. My stepdaughter can be a bit dramatic. But his eyes darted nervously, and his hands were clenched at his sides. The officers didn't buy it. They pushed past him, and I followed, my heart in my throat. The room was not what I expected. It was indeed an office, but it was disturbingly neat, almost sterile. And then I saw her. Maya was huddled in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, her face tear-streaked and bruised, her eyes wide with terror. She looked small. Broken. My breath hitched. Maya. I cried, rushing towards her. An officer immediately stepped between us, gesturing for me to stay back, while another moved to Maya, speaking to her gently. Mark started to protest. She's just upset, she has anxiety, it's nothing. But the officers weren't listening to him. One of them, a younger man, was scanning the room with his flashlight. He stopped at a small, almost invisible device tucked into a bookshelf, partially obscured by a stack of binders. It was a tiny camera, no bigger than my thumb, pointed directly at the armchair where Maya had been sitting. Then he moved to Mark's desk, where a laptop was open, its screen displaying a folder labeled Maya's Progress. He clicked it open, and what flashed on the screen made my stomach churn, a series of time-stamped photos and videos of Maya, some showing her in vulnerable states, others of her in her own bedroom, taken through what must have been another hidden camera. There were also spreadsheets, meticulously detailing her spending, her contacts, even her daily schedule. This wasn't just a scream, this was the culmination of years of calculated surveillance and abuse. Mark's face went from feigned innocence to pure panic. He lunged for the laptop, but an officer swiftly intercepted him, restraining him. "You sick bastard!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. My mother, who had been woken by the commotion and was now standing in the doorway, let out a strangled cry as she saw Maya, then the laptop screen. Her face crumpled in horror and disbelief. "Mark? What have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The scene that followed was a blur of police procedure, paramedics attending to Maya, and Mark being cuffed and led away, still muttering denials. Maya was taken to the hospital for examination and support, and I went with her. Mom was left behind, shattered, grappling with the unthinkable reality of the man she had loved and trusted. In the days and weeks that followed, the truth slowly unraveled. The police found more hidden cameras, not just in Mark's study, but subtly placed in common areas, and even one in Maya's own bedroom. The financial help he'd given Maya was a sham. He'd been siphoning off her meager savings, controlling every penny she had, and fabricating reasons for her to stay dependent. The study wasn't just an office, it was his surveillance hub, a control room for his sick obsession. Mark was charged with multiple counts, including invasion of privacy, stalking, and sexual assault. The house felt hollowed out, tainted. My mother, initially consumed by grief and denial, slowly began to process the betrayal. It was a long, painful road for her, confronting her own blindness, her own desire for a happy ending that had allowed this monster into our lives. She started therapy, as did Maya. Maya's recovery was slow, marked by intense trauma and fear, but she was alive, and she was safe. I became her fierce advocate, her unwavering support. We moved out of that house a few months later, Mom selling it, unable to bear living in the place where such darkness had festered. The locked study door, once a symbol of Mark's privacy, then his insidious control, now stood open. It was just a room, stripped bare, waiting for new owners to fill it with their own lives. I walked past it one last time before we left, the silence deafening. The only thing left was the faint imprint of where his heavy desk had been, a ghost of the secrets it had held. Maya is getting stronger every day, slowly reclaiming her life, piece by painful piece. We still have a long way to go, but at least now, her door is truly her own.